This is an introduction to Lockdown, assuming you've never used the plugin before. This is the shot we're going to look at. The left is the raw footage, the right is the final result. To get started, it's under Effect, Vronos, Lockdown. The first thing you have to do is ensure the layer you're tracking is at a scale of 100% centered in a composition which matches in terms of frame rate and resolution. If that's not the case, just press this Pre-Compose button, and your shot will be pre-composed to ensure those settings are correct. Lockdown will be placed on this inner comp and taken out of the outer one. We'll skip the optional tracking filter. Lockdown is based off of points. The points are tracked, a mesh is generated, and then a texture can be applied to the mesh. To create points, you can Control-Click, or you can Control-Click and drag to create a lasso and create a region of points. You can change the density here with the lasso grid pixel distance. You can Alt-Click to delete points. You can Alt-Click and drag to delete many points. When considering the accuracy of your tracks, there are 3-point track methods. Accurate is the default because it can just track right away. However, it's not the most accurate method in Lockdown. The most accurate method is using connected vectors with the extremely accurate preset. This renders out a motion vector pass where it tracks every pixel in the shot and saves it to an EXR pass where you can quickly and easily attach points. We have a button that makes this easy. Skip over the connected vector slot and press full vector setup. Skip past these alerts. You'll notice in your output module, it's set to import and replace usage. This is because the goal is to create an EXR pass. If we take a look at the composition that's being rendered, it has an effect on it called Generate Vectors. You can't see anything with this right now, but I'll put on some contrast just so you can. This is the motion tracking data. Don't add contrast to your shot or it definitely won't work, so I'm going to remove those. That was just for example's sake. And you'll notice back in the main comp where we had pressed that button, Lockdown has sourced that linked vectors layer as a means of tracking points. Depending on the shot, Generate Vectors can take anywhere between 5 seconds and a minute to render a single frame. So you absolutely don't want to be working with this data live, which is why it's in the render queue, being baked to an EXR pass. You'll notice it's set to import and replace. That's because the Generate Vectors plugin is extremely slow and heavy, so the idea is once it's rendered, it's replaced with an EXR pass, which is very fast to read. Press render. That render is finished. It took about 8 minutes, so a little bit slow, but we'll work on speeding that up. If we go back to our main composition, you'll see the EXR passes here, replacing the composition with the Generate Vectors effect. In Lockdown, this composition is still sourced in the connected vector slot. Before we can track this, go to your EXR pass, right-click, go to Interpret Footage, Main, Color Management, and Preserve RGB, or this just won't work. And now when you create points, and press to track points, the process is very fast. This is in real time. And you can see how accurate the track is. This is because the motion vector pass takes every part of the image into consideration when generating the motion vectors. I know that 8 minutes is a long time to wait for a 1-second shot, and if you extrapolate 6 seconds, that might take almost an hour. But seriously, go get a coffee or something, render this over lunch, render it overnight. You just can't beat the accuracy with this tracking mode. It's going to save you tons of time of manual effort. Before getting too in-depth with specific techniques, I'm going to use a smaller lasso grid pixel distance, and I'll use these points to create a mesh. Press Auto Triangulate Mesh. You can Alt-Click to delete unnecessary edge connections. And then press Apply Mesh on this frame to stabilize the mesh. Which means it's trying to take the motion of each tracking point and take that part of the texture and lock it down to one place in the frame. So you can see for the most part it's done that. The idea is that when this is stabilized, you can edit it in the same way you would edit a Photoshop composition, and then it will apply back to the video. The next step is to press Lockdown. This process is going to create 2 layers. The first is your background layer, Nothing special here, there are no effects on it. The second is the stabilized pre-composition. And if I solo this, you'll notice that this is following the motion of the shot. If I put the background back on and set it to 50% opacity, this stabilized pre-comp is matching the motion of the original shot exactly. So in effect, when I go into this stabilized pre-comp, I can place text. When I play this, you'll see that the text is aligned with the stabilized video. And when I move back to the main composition, I'll turn the background opacity back up. You can see that the text is stuck to the jellyfish. The most common help ticket that we get is for this black border that we get here. And again, this is our fault. This is like a minor bug, but this is really, really easy to fix. This is just an artifact of stabilizing and only having part of the edge here, and then returning only part of that edge to when it's reverse stabilized. So one of the solutions is to just shut this layer off, so all you have is text in here, and now that edge is gone. However, if you wanted to do paint work on here, so for example, if you wanted to change the pattern of these spots or something, I'll just do that very quickly. Maybe for some reason we want way more points just in this area. So you can see those points now attached to the stabilized mesh, and this is exactly why we have a stabilized mesh, so paint work is easy to do. Now to get rid of this border, the easiest way is on this layer just to apply a matte choker of maybe 2 pixels and just push into that alpha channel. You can see the before and after. And when we go back to the main composition, you can see the paint work. And of course, you don't see the dark edge. Those are the basics of using Lockdown, but now I'm going to go through the plugin top to bottom to explain just about everything in it. To undo the work that I've done, I'm going to take this jellyfish layer that's been stabilized, and I'll delete those 2 paint effects on it. And I'll copy and I'll paste this back out into my main composition. And I'll unapply the mesh and turn render points back on. So these are the layers that were created by the Lockdown script. I'm just going to delete those. And now we're back to where we were. I'll delete all these points so we can focus on more specific techniques. The big trick to success with Lockdown is editing your points. So I think usually the best bet with any shot is to try to track the hardest points first. To me, it definitely looks like this edge is the hardest. This edge where the jellyfish head meets with the jellyfish tail. And if you look at this point specifically, let's move along here, it actually leaves view momentarily. So that will be a challenge to deal with. Let's start by tracking a little bit away from the edge. So looking at these points, I can see a few points that are probably going to be pretty easy. So for example, this one right here, I'll control click to place a point, then track it. And the main reason I want to track this inner point is it's just going to make it easier for me as an imperfect human to watch where these points on the bottom go. This is sort of a reference point. So if I wanted to track this point here, which is one of the hard ones that goes out of view, I'll control click it and press to track points. And you'll notice that gets lost as we go out of frame. So again, because all these look very similar, the main reason I made this point is because we know that we just have to follow this little row of points down. Otherwise, you might accidentally pick something different when it goes out of view than comes back into view. This isn't actually necessary for the track, it's just because that's how my brain works. So let's scroll to about the last frame where this is correct, and we can adjust the track's position just by clicking and dragging. So I'll move that onto where it's supposed to be, and then move back a couple of frames, keeping that on there, and then I'll move forward, and it almost comes back to where it's supposed to be. So I'll just click and drag this into place over the course of a few frames. And eventually, with a little bit of manual adjustment, this point should be following pretty well. Of course, maybe right here where this tucks in, I'll just scoot that up. So that's pretty good. That's easy to do. There's another method for tracking points that go out of frame that might actually be better. Again, just for simplicity, I'm going to start by creating a reference point and track that. Okay, so that's there to help guide our eye. And now let's track one of these really difficult points. So looking down this line of dots, let's try to track this point right here. And you can see it drifted quite a bit. So one of the easy methods to track this point that goes out for a moment is to track from the start frame forward, here, and then find the same point when it's visible again, and track from the end frame backward, and merge these 2 points into one. So the way that this works is we'll follow our first point up until about where it starts to go off. So maybe about here is, I'd say, the last point where I'm really confident in it. So I'm going to unselect it and then select it here. And it remembers this frame, frame 110, remembers where it's selected. That's a very important detail to merging points. And then I'm going to go to the end frame and look at this point and start to move backward and say maybe right here is the last frame where this point makes sense. So I'm going to shift click it, and now both of these points are red. And as I play through the shot, you can see that they turn red in the area between the 2 frames where I shift selected them. So when I press merge points, it's going to blend these 2 keyframe tracks together, starting only in the red regions, meaning on the left side, we're starting with the first keyframes tracks all the way up until the red, and then it will start to blend the 2 together until we get to the far end, the timeline right side. I'll press merge points. And you can see how those have been merged. So that's a really, really easy way to deal with points that have gone out of the frame. And then you can do a little bit of adjustment on top of this. And this is just where the human brain kind of compensates for what machines can't really do. And just knowing that this should kind of be on the edge, I'll just put this out here, even if it's bleeding over a little bit. That looks okay. So tracking these 2 points that went out of view wasn't very hard. I'm just going to speed through a couple more of these. I feel like I only need to do a couple of points on this edge because the motion is mostly uniform. Also, one thing to point out is that Lockdown 1.4 can only track it 1 frame at a time. So you might be thinking what I could do is create a tracking point here, and then go back, and then create another tracking point here for that same point, and then press track for both of them. Unfortunately, that is not possible yet. In a future build, probably very soon, we're going to handle that. But for now, you have to just track on 1 frame, press to track points, and then track on another frame. We will address that as quickly as possible. So those are the basics of tracking that edge. And now I'll track a little bit more of this jellyfish head. Knowing that all of these points are going to probably be pretty easy to track, I'm going to start with a wider lasso and just place my points all around, and actually maybe for this area, I'll see what I can get away with. I might have to delete these points. And I'll track. So most of these look pretty good. Knowing that this area moves well, I'll get a little more aggressive. And knowing that I won't have to do any manual correction, because you can generally tell that all these points are on, I'm just going to add a lot of points in here, so that way we'll have a smoother deformation. And by the way, the lasso grid pixel distance was 50 when I last placed these points. If you cut that in half, the new points will go evenly in between them if you're drawing them on the same frame. Common sense, but I thought I'd point it out. For the most part, the tracks are looking pretty good. I see one point up here that's getting confused by, I'll just up the exposure. You can kind of see there's some piece of garbage floating behind the jellyfish. So this point goes crazy. And one of the most important tools to editing tracks is the ability to delete some of the keyframes, but use them where they're good. If we look at this tracking point, it looks really good up until about this frame right here. So we want to use this tracking data up until this point, and just not on this frame and any further. So I'll go to the last frame where it's good, knowing that it was good starting from the right side from the end and bad towards the beginning, and I'll delete backward keyframes, deleting to the direction to the left. And now you'll notice that that point disappears. In Lockdown, you never want to have points that stray off of their target. You'd rather the keyframe track just end. Because there's a tool called Interpolate Partial Tracks, where it's going to take an incomplete track, and on the frames where it doesn't exist, once you press this button, it's going to create an interpolated track, which is dark blue. And see here? So it switches over from the last good frame, starting at this side of the shot where it's this light blue. And then dark blue, it says that this is no longer using its own tracking data. It's looking to the points around it and just following along. And you can see that mostly works. So again, I could do a merge, or I could just generally watch this and see where this point is going. And it is pretty close. However, I'm just going to drift that back on. I'm getting a little too sacred for the purpose of this tutorial, but I really want to cover every possible technique for those of you that are actually willing to sit through and listen to it. Thank you very much. There's one other way to edit tracking points that I think is a little bit less important because we're changing how things go from 1.4 and forward. But you can select any point here, for example, and press Externalize Selected Points. So internalized points, you'll notice that these don't show up as keyframes down here. These are kept internal to the plugin. And this is how all the points should be because they're going to move way faster. When you externalize this selected point, there are 4 total keyframe tracks. We're sorry, but there used to be 500 for any of you who had used a previous version of Lockdown. We found that that was causing a UI responsiveness issue to have all of those parameters where there would be slight delays in clicking and dragging. And we figured that the lesser of 2 evils was to have only 4 of these, that way your interactions were much faster, and take away the other 496 points. Now if you press the U key, you can see these keyframes here. And you can delete them, and you'll notice that this keyframe track will follow linearly from its last keyframe to its next. However, I would probably never advise actually working like this unless there's, maybe one jitter that just pops off to the side. What I would probably do is edit this externally. So you can copy and paste these to a null object. And this null does not show up very well on this red jellyfish. Actually, this jellyfish was blue when it started. I just put some hue on it because it was too hard to see these points. And you can edit these nulls, any way that you would in After Effects. So for example, as much as this isn't something that you would want to do for this shot, I could just kind of scoot these keyframes up. And now I can copy these, and if I want to bring these back into Lockdown, one of the ways is I could either delete this externalized point here, or I could create another keyframe, and I'll press U on this 0.2 track, and then I'll paste. And right now you can't see that, but if you just go to Select All Points, that will refresh and update. And you'll notice that this new keyframe track is exactly on top of that null object. So I'll delete this null object so that's a little bit easier to see. These externalized points are a light blue color. It's highly recommended that you don't use these externalized points for your mesh. The best thing you can do is select all of your points and internalize all the points to make sure that these are inside the plugin. Everything will just move faster and reduce the likelihood of something going wrong. Another method for tracking is using Mocha. So how do you get points out of Mocha into Lockdown? Apply Mocha to the same layer that Lockdown is on, and I'd probably put it above Lockdown. And just for example's sake, I'll create 2 tracks down here that will be out of the way. These 4 corners are the points that Lockdown is going to import from Mocha, so place them logically. And these 2 layers are done, so I'll save Mocha and close. In Mocha, go to the tracking data dropdown and go to create track data. We have layer 2, that's fine, press OK. And then these keyframes are exposed in the Mocha effect. Just go here to Lockdown and click Mocha Face Tracker Import. And you can see those 4 points have been imported. Then again, go to create track data in Mocha, choose the other layer, press OK. And actually, because there's only 4 externalized points in Lockdown, you have to internalize these first. So select all points, press internalize. I know this is inconvenient, and probably in the next version we will have it so these auto-internalize so you don't have to do that step. And then press the Mocha Face Tracker Import button again, and it imports those points. And again, go to select all point, internalize selected points. And now these are built into Lockdown. So Mocha is obviously an extremely powerful and useful tracker, so it's fantastic that you can get those points in there. I'll just delete Mocha, we don't need this anymore. And actually, I'll delete these points because I think I want to be focused on just the head for this jellyfish, not for the tail. And let's look into mesh building. To create a mesh, there's this button Auto Triangulate Mesh that will get you most of the way. However, I'd say if there are any sensitive areas in your shot, then you should probably do some manual connections. So for example, if you select a point, then hold down Control-Shift and click the next point, you can manually create an edge. And now I'll just play this, and that's exactly what we're looking for. Another thing before I auto-triangulate is we don't quite have all the detail here that we need. Maybe I will add a few more points. Again, I did this to perfection when I actually did this shot. I don't know if I really feel like going through all that detail in the tutorial with everyone watching. Close enough, but we'll pretend I did. Another thing that's very important is to have the mesh bleed over the edges of the object. So we need to create extension points. To create an extension point past the borders of the mesh, hold down Control-Shift-Alt and click. Command-Shift-Alt on Mac. I'm on Windows right now. And I'd probably try to create these pretty close to the points on the mesh. Just a little bit of extra room. And these extension points are really just tracks with one single keyframe, and using interpolate partial tracks, they follow the rest of the mesh. So with interpolate partial tracks off, you'll notice that you can't see any of these points. However, when we get to that last frame, there they are. And then with interpolate partial tracks on, these points just loosely outline the mesh. And of course, there's some definition problems here, where these are following along more of the other points than the ones that they should be. So in this case, you might need to actually do some more manual tracking, same with up on this side. However, I'm not going to do that. Let's just get to applying the mesh. Now that your manual connections have been made, you can press Auto Triangulate. Alt-click to delete any connections that you don't like. Maybe you could have extended a little bit more down here, but actually I will do that. Sometimes it gets a little bit confused when you add these new points, just connect them manually. Right, I see what's happening. There was a connection from this line to that line previously, so there's no way to connect those two. And let's press Apply Mesh on this frame. So you can see where this worked and where it didn't. It wouldn't take too much more effort to track these areas better. We're not going to do that. I'll press Lockdown to complete the process. Moving into the stabilized comp, I want to apply a texture. This was the texture that I used in the demo video. And just to make this easier to see, I'm going to take this stabilized layer, turn this into a guide layer, and I'm going to desaturate it. And just as a bit of maintenance, I'm going to move back into my main comp and also desaturate this background layer. Moving back into my stabilized, I have this spiral texture, and I'm going to overlay this. Something like that. And moving back into my main comp, because this is taking up the whole geometry, it's not following the edges, but this is easy enough to solve. I'll duplicate my original background layer, and I'm going to use composite brush. I'll solo this and set it to stencil alpha to pull a key. Just clicking and dragging on the stuff that I want to get rid of, and then alt clicking and dragging on the stuff that I want to keep. I'll put a slight blur on here. 5 pixels is probably good. And then I'll map this texture into it. Actually, probably less than 5 pixels, maybe 2 will get it done. And I'll also set this stabilized texture to overlay. Right away, that's not looking too bad. Except, of course, this edge has extension points that aren't tucking under the bottom. So we can fix this inside of the stabilized pre-comp. In this stabilized pre-comp, I'm just going to hide the spiral for a moment and make a new solid. This should actually go above the spiral because it's going to act as a mask. And I'm just loosely going to trace the edge. And I'll just move frame to frame and loosely trace this. That'll probably look okay. I'll smooth out these keyframes and set this spiral layer to alpha matte. And I'll put a feather on this. Maybe 5 pixels might be enough. Maybe 10. And that's looking mostly pretty good. I think that covers pretty much everything you need to know about Lockdown. Again, it's just a little bit more manual tracking to fix up those other areas, and you can have results something like this. Thanks for watching. For more info, check out aescripts.com/lockdown.